Welcome to Digestible Academia, a BlueSky Thinking podcast where we break down complex academic research into something a bit more digestible. In this episode, in recognition of International Women's Day and Women's History Month here in the UK, we're continuing our exploration into diversity, equality, and inclusion.
If you listened to our last episode, you'll know that whilst DEI cuts are currently the top of the news and the political agenda, a significant amount of academic research finds that greater diversity in a company can provide significant benefits. So why is it that when companies face tough times, diversity is often the first thing to go? And what more can organisations do when it comes to supporting and progressing women?
So to find out more, we spoke with Jackie Ford, a professor in leadership and organisation studies at Durham University Business School. Jackie is an expert in leadership studies and in gender and organisation theory. Her research covers working lives, leadership, gender diversity and inclusion, ethics, management, and organisation studies, as well as the underrepresentation of women as leaders. We asked Jackie why, after so many years of board quotas and other efforts to boost inclusivity, women still do not hold equal footing in the majority of workplaces, and how companies should and can navigate this.
This was a fantastic interview, which really tapped into some of the implicit and explicit frustrations that women face every day. Jackie spoke about the power of small acts of rebellion in challenging gender stereotypes. We hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we've enjoyed recording it.
So, Professor Jackie Ford, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and about your research, please?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm currently Professor of Leadership and Organisation Studies at Durham University Business School. And I've been in Durham for about 7.5 years. And prior to moving into an academic role about 30 years ago, I worked as an executive director of human resources in an NHS trust. So I had 10 years in real management jobs and over 30 years studying them. So that's really my background. And in relation to research interests, I think you...
Yeah, if you could just tell us a bit more about your research.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so my research interests really revolve around the study of people at work, so people's working lives, what they do, how they behave, how they react and interact with each other, but especially around studies of critical leadership. And by that, I mean things like what goes wrong, what's not good about leadership practices and behaviours, what should we be doing differently, how can we encourage change in organisations. And my main lens through which I look at those areas are through sort of feminist lenses, through psychoanalytic thinking. I'm especially interested in diversity, gender diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And the impact on organisational policies and practices that have a tendency to favour particular ways of being and thinking and organising, privileging some behaviours over others, like frequently white, male, middle-class men in organisations. So I'm interested in critiquing those. And I'm also very firmly embedded to qualitative research methods. So I think quantitative research has a place in terms of generalisation and proof, but qualitative research can really get to the nub of the contextually specific, subtle, nuanced ways in which people react and interact in the workplace.
So obviously all that research that you've mentioned is all very, very important. But why is it so important to you? What sparked your interest in it? And could you tell us a bit more about why you care so much about it?
Sure, yeah. I think my own personal experiences of having good and bad managers and leaders very, right at the start of my career. And then I think being launched into a senior managerial role at quite an early age in the NHS. And experiencing firsthand the complexity of management and leadership in organisations. But I think I think Shakespeare once talked about knowledge of good bought dear by knowing ill. So when things have gone wrong, you learn a lot. But I think there's a positive twist to that as well, that when you've worked with fantastic leaders, you can learn, you can aspire to sort of emulate their behaviours and practices and ways of working as well. So I think it's that combination. It's the passion for understanding people at work, looking at relationships of people at work, guided by, what's going on, what's happening, looking nationally, internationally at political figures. I mean, we can learn an awful lot from the current climate of policies and practices of politics, but also more locally as well. So it's that combination, really. It's the fascination. It's probably licensed nosiness as well, that, what people are doing at work, what's engaging them, how are they getting through the day, how passionate people are, how dispassionate people are, all those factors, really.
Yeah, and I think that professional and personal aspect that you've mentioned, I can see why that would really come through in your work.
And it's obviously it is very important at the moment. Like you say, it's emotive work that you're doing, and it's certainly an emotive topic that a lot of us can relate to on a very personal nature. And as we all know, particularly when we're looking at women and equality in the workplace, it's still a bit of a biased picture. Women are still in the minority in most professional settings, especially when it comes to getting women into leadership roles as well. But like you say, Jackie, certainly through your own research, it's not through a lack of awareness or a lack of action on that. So I wondered if you thought if there are any particular reasons why, initiatives such as quotas or positive discrimination, they've perhaps not been as successful as we'd hoped in trying to level the playing field.
Yeah, I mean, those are really important points. And actually, some countries have effectively changed their working practices and cultures through the use of quotas, etc. But it hasn't been a universal success. I've recently written a paper with Sarah Gilmore and Nancy Harding, in which we expressed our concern at the slow pace of change over the last 50 years, for example, since in the UK, the Sex Discrimination Act was launched in 1975. And in that paper, we described the ways in which the Act has helped. It certainly helped our entrance as professional workers into organisations. But then after that, I think it was women themselves who found ways of ensuring that they could stay in organisations, survive and even thrive in them. Women do indeed, as you say, remain the minority in professional and leadership roles. But there's been an increased recognition of their legitimacy, their right to be here, to work in these organisations, to exist. And I think we've also seen the emergence of role models, female role models who've tended to be more collaborative, more relational, more empathetic, and reportedly more feminine in their approach. Colleagues have, for example, written about Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister in New Zealand, and other female role models who've not been constrained by the masculine norms that tend to dominate leadership practice. So it's that empathy, that shared purpose, the compassion of such individuals who have been celebrated. And I think that's something that we need to reflect on, really.
Yeah. And like you say, that things like having role modelling and the whole sort of being what you can see and you can't be what you can't see certainly has had a huge impact, like you say. But of course, we still have a long way to go, and certainly I'm sure your research reflects that too. I wondered if you thought, besides role modelling, are there any initiatives that have been put in place that you see as being particularly successful, both in advancing women to, get the professional recognition they work so hard for and they deserve, but also just in trying to erase those barriers as well, so that there is just more, maybe even erasing those ways of thinking like you were talking about a second ago. Is there anything that's in place at the moment that works particularly well, do you think?
Yeah, well, I don't know whether we can pinpoint any one initiative, although I do think it could be the case that programmes of equality, diversion and inclusion in organisations have helped significantly to open up opportunities for women in organisations and other minoritised groups as well. through addressing some of the systemic biases and promoting much more of an inclusive approach. And I think embracing equality, diversity and inclusion does mean that we all need to think differently. And I think that has been over the years, something that's been fairly fundamental. So I'm really concerned at the recent pushback in the US and elsewhere in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion at work, and very much hope it isn't going to become a trend. There's a real danger that this will stop or even reverse some of the progress that we've made in recent years, with really significant potential negative consequences for the presence of women at work. I think the very fact that we have seen a growth in numbers of women in professional and managerial roles has made a difference. They are more visible and their voices are being recognised. So it would be a travesty if we saw a reverse of any of those initiatives now.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you've just said, really. So could you share some of the hurdles and the challenges that women face, rising into those leadership positions that perhaps aren't as commonly discussed as the main issues we often hear about? For example, are there any subtle cultural norms in workplaces that generally prevent women from taking on these higher roles, would you say?
I think there are some subtle and some not so subtle tendencies. I think there remains a tendency to fixate on hierarchical and traditional forms of leadership, with much too much attention paid to senior elite leaders as masculine superheroes. And, we see that played out in politics, in organisations. I don't even have to name them. I think everybody can identify with many of those.
Yeah.
And this sort of attention to the senior elite just reinforces the notion of leaders as powerful, who have run the risk of manipulating their environments in their own egotistical interests for personal gain. And I'm involved in writing another paper which looks very much at the gains that some leaders are taking. And I think this all reinforces the masculine leadership behaviours, that takes the form of the competitive, the aggressive, the self-reliant individualist in the workplace, against which both women and men as leaders are judged. That those are the norms that exist in organisations, and sometimes they're very subtle and hidden, and at other times, they are much more spoken. And I think it's these dominant norms and practices that need to be questioned so that we can explore how to be more inclusive of other minoritized individuals' experiences, as well as others, including men who don't identify with the popular imagery of leadership or masculinity. It's not just about women or minoritized groups. So I think those are probably, it's those hidden hurdles. When they're stated and explicit, you can do something about them. But when they're implicit and just under the radar, they're much more difficult to address.
And that's a really good point as well that you've raised, that it's not just about the women, it's about the men as well. Mm-hmm. And that, feminism and DEI policies benefit both men and women a lot. So it's not just the women we need to be focusing on. Mm-hmm. But going back to women, are there particular groups or types of women that are more likely to succeed than others in gaining these leadership roles? And if so, why do you think that is?
I think it's a good question. I get a bit worried about generalising on types.
Yeah.
But I think we have seen successful progress made by women who adopt a more collaborative and relational forms of leadership. Jacinda Ardern, as I've mentioned, but there are lots of other examples as well. Indeed, our own dean at the business school in Durham operates in that way, and I think that's been highly effective in all sorts of ways. And of course, there's plenty of research that explores ways in which some women have adopted more masculine behaviours in an attempt to fit in, sometimes with very mixed success. In my own thinking and work, I've learned a lot from the writings of a feminist psychoanalyst called Jessica Benjamin. Mm-hmm. She highlights the importance of recognition, of acknowledgement in the workplace. So we recognise each other, the mutuality of recognition, if you like. And I translate that into my research in organisations. So she argues that humans crave social stimulation, they crave warmth, they crave emotional interchanges right from the beginning of life. And this continues in the workplace. You know, we're active social beings. We need interaction with and recognition from others so that we can make the best sense of who we are and how we relate to other people. And I think it's through these practices of mutual recognition of our need to be recognised as well as recognise the other that allows us to steer a course away from the dominance of the heroic leader figure and into a much more mutual, collaborative, kind of networked approach, that relational approach that I referred to earlier. So I think that's one important feature. But I think the other side of all of this is that those who are in non-leader roles, the followers or the more junior colleagues or however we describe and depict them, they need to take responsibility for claiming their voice as well and to value the contribution that they make. So speaking up and speaking out is really important. It's denouncing that victim position can be really vital. And I think, it's a courageous thing to do often. But I think it's very important that we do that. And we also explored in one of our papers the importance of adopting everyday strategies of resistance, is how we called it in the paper. But it's taking back control, it's taking ownership and responsibility for the things that we do, so that we do speak out about violations of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable at work. Certainly what was tolerated 50 years ago or even 40 years ago, I could tell you some horror stories of my workplace experience at 40 years ago when I started work. That's no longer acceptable. If I look at my children's generation, they wouldn't put up with some of those features. But there's still things that are going on that we ought to be pushing back at. And it's this pushing back that I think is really important.
Yeah. I think that what you said a second ago about sort of how leaders are seen it is a really important thing to focus on, because you're right in that old traditional sort of stereotype as the leader sort of being this domineering, powerful figure. They can't be questioned. They, what they say goes. It is very limiting, like you said, for men or for women, and particularly, we've seen the backlash against, women who take on senior roles and adopt those sort of masculine strategies. And there is the negativity that comes from that. Women are seen as bossy, so you're bossy, not the boss, and all those horrible tropes that sort of come through as a result of women trying to be too stereotypically masculine, I suppose, to fit into those roles. So I think highlighting that and showing that, you get more out of people by being collaborative, by sort of softening those boundaries, allowing people to work together and to share their ideas, is certainly really valuable. And when you think that you spend most of your time at work, a lot of people spend more time at work than they do at home and with their families, being comfortable in your workplace is so important, not just for your own growth, but your well-being as well. And you've touched on it a little bit. And my next question was going to look at, what needs to change within a workplace in order to make it a more accessible place for everybody, whether it is a leader or those more junior roles like you describe. And I think you've probably answered part of that already, the fact that we do need to be more collaborative. We need to be part of work environments that support people speaking up and speaking out and challenging and sharing their ideas. And I know that you've recently published papers that explore sort of how far female voice can travel and sort of what the impact of that is. So I wonder what else you might have to share on, those things that need to adapt within workplaces to make them more accessible for everyone, really.
Yeah, again, I think it's raising awareness of a lot of these issues is important. And that's what part of what we try to do through these papers. So the recent paper that you alluded to that was published in the Journal of Management Studies sought to highlight some of the struggles associated with the female voice, notably reflecting the dominance of what some other writers, Nair and others, have talked about, vocal masculinity or deep male voices that favourably, the research evidence identifies that those are favourably associated with positive perceptions of leadership qualities and ability. So it's very difficult. I mean, remember the discussions about Margaret Thatcher deepening her voice when she came into power, and that was a deliberate act to seek to overcome some of the negative features of feminine voices. And feminine voice sonics might still be associated culturally with inferiority. So you hear a woman's voice spoken in the boardroom or in a meeting or in the corridors at work, that can have a negative consequence. Similarly, for example, in students' evaluations of female lecturers in my own context, there's a lot of research that identifies that women are marked more strictly by students, and voice is obviously going to be a feature of that. But I think the growing presence of female commentators, of politicians, including presidents and prime ministers, leaders of major global and national organisations, challenges the idea that feminine voice sonics are weak, and therefore women in organisational contexts are also weak. So in our paper, what we talked about is the power to care, which we argued is an ethical stance that needn't be associated with women because its influence can imbibe other people in the workplace too. And it can also offer a point of resistance from this traditional male voice sonic. So by raising awareness, people start to think about it a little bit more. So you can try to have an impact through other means as well. So I think there are things that you can do, and challenges that you can make. Again, I suppose the older I've become, the more important it's been for me to be more active and reactive to and so through my publications, through my talks, through other means, I've sought to try to take more of an activist role than just a sort of a writing role, if you like.
Do you think there's a responsibility there in you sort of, like you say, being so far through your career now and sort of passing back what you've learned and those advantages to others to then give them a step forward and a step up?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there are lots of initiatives that are being taken. I mean, many of us act as mentors, as guides, as support to men and women in the workplace, to seek to ensure that the experiences that some of us have had aren't replicated in other ways. So definitely. Yeah.
I think you're right. I think all women have those, unfortunately, we all have those horror stories, don't we? We all have those things we reflect on and things that have happened to us in the past, whether, no matter how small, that you wouldn't then wish to the next woman that was coming through, whether it's, just being as simple as, overlooked or undermined, or, having those sort of stereotypes of, being female, therefore less capable, then has that impact. So, yeah, I think absolutely having those people that can pass back and can positively change things for the next people coming through, it's vitally important. And like you said a few minutes ago, particularly the world we're living in now, and we're seeing what may happen with DEI in future, it's never been more vital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, that's another reason why your research is so important, Jackie, to be honest. So with everything that you've mentioned, what do you think it would take to make leadership feel welcoming and not just accessible to women?
I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer easily. I think it's chipping away, continuing this, small acts of resistance or bigger acts of speaking out, I think it's about, we do need to recognise the heterogeneity, the whole complexity of different ways of people's voices, perspectives, views that we need in organisations. We need that diversity because that's what creates more innovation, more entrepreneurship, and there's many more ways to lead effectively than the predominant one that still dominates our workplace. And I think ignoring 50% of the population is something that you do at your peril.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really simple when you put it like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I know there's been a lot of talk recently about how we need more masculine energy in the workplace. And yeah, I think everything you've just said that seems very obvious, but apparently, to some people it
well,
isn't so.
that's why we need to fight back. We need to, argue a counterpoint to those arguments that are grounded much more in reality than making those sorts of claims.
Mm-hmm. And there's evidence that backs it up. I mean, there are countless research papers out there that show that having greater diversity, it doesn't have to just be a male female thing, but having greater diversity in your leadership, in your teams, in your structure, it brings a greater wealth of ideas, of innovations, of ways that you can make progress. So if you're cutting off 50% of the population to suit some predetermined norm, I mean, how does anything ever move forward?
Yeah, well, it doesn't. It will stagnate or reverse, and that's the biggest concern. That's one of the biggest fears of the way that the populist moves are heading. That will stifle debate and discussion, and drive it underground. And that really is. We'll get this sort of consensus perspective. And dissent will just be driven underground. It'll surface in different ways, and that's more worrying because again, you need to encourage constructive dissent, and this is putting the lid on those ideas. And what people have called destructive consent, so you're just hiding the conflict behind a superficial perspective. People ought to be able to speak freely and to voice their opinions and ideas and ways in which to progress. I mean, it's not all negative. There are some very positive perspectives that we can all offer to make differences that can improve the workplace or improve profits or improve the direction that we need to head in.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it all comes back, like you said a little while ago about, this work being so important. And we talked right at the beginning of this discussion about what it was that made you passionate about your work. It's, considering the world we're living in at the moment, it's never been more vital, whether you're looking at it from a rights perspective or just a competitive perspective in terms of how to make your business do better. So yeah, absolutely why, it's been so valuable to have a chat with you about this and to share your work and to hopefully provide a bit of guidance to someone listening who might be able to apply some of what you've said in their own working lives.
Thanks very much. No, I've enjoyed the discussion, and I think it is so important that we keep sharing this message. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please do like, share, and subscribe for more, and we'll see you next time.